Hey, hello Bio2, this is Mr. B. We're continuing on with our second part of birds. If you remember how the last video ended, we talked about all the different ways that bird beaks are modified to the various foods that they eat, and so we're going to kind of continue on with talking about the different ways that birds can feed. And so our first thing is kind of an important one, is that birds do not have teeth at all, and therefore they cannot chew. So birds cannot chew their food whatsoever. However, they have overcome this by having many specialized structures that help them to digest their food, which was part of their digestive system. Remember, going back, way back when, one of the advantages to having a one-way digestive system is you can have very specialized regions, and birds really exemplify that. And so our first major structure for birds is what is known as the crop. And this is a really important one. So the crop is a structure that's at the lower end of the esophagus, and inside of the crop food is stored and then is moistened to help in the digestive process. So kind of the main one that we probably need to know is the storage of food. It's probably the most important part. So now we're going to kind of follow the path that food takes when it enters the bird. So the first step is when a bird eats, food moves down the esophagus. So our first step is mouth to esophagus, and therefore it is stored in the crop. So that is our first step here. The bird eats the food, goes into their esophagus, and after the esophagus it's stored here in this crop. And in some birds, the crop also has a second function. So besides the storage and the moistening, is that during nesting season sometimes, so when there's going to be babies around, the crop will produce a substance that's rich in protein and fat. And then parents will therefore regurgitate this and feed that to their newly hatched young. So it's kind of almost similar to like with mammals, which we'll get into in our next chapter, producing milk. So it's a substance that they can use to kind of help nourish the young birds and provide them with the material that they need to grow. So all birds use crop for storage and moistening food. Some birds have a second function where they can use it to produce a substance that's rich in protein and fat. So little side note, but then now we'll keep on going with our path of food. So then after we have the crop, the moistened food passes to the stomach, which is a two-part chamber. So the stomach in birds is made up of two parts, and the first chamber of the stomach, we'll get into what each one does. So the first chamber secretes acids and enzymes, which kind of, again, they just help break down the food even more. So that's the first chamber of the stomach. It doesn't have a specialized name. It's just called the first chamber of the stomach, as you can see here. However, the second chamber has a specialized name, which we call the gizzard. And so the partially digested food moves from the first chamber to the second chamber. And again, the second chamber is called the gizzard. That's an important thing you need to know. The second chamber is called the gizzard. And then the gizzard is an important structure because it's one that's found only in birds. And it's the reason why the gizzard is important, because birds that eat meat or fish, they have an expandable area in which large amounts of that soft food can be stored, kind of going along with the crop. However, birds that eat insects or seeds, they have a muscular organ called the gizzard that helps in the mechanical breakdown of food. So again, it's just kind of another structure that helps with the breaking down food, and mechanically, it's like physically grinding it up. And our next slide is going to tell us how they do that. So the muscular walls of the gizzard, they squeeze the contents, so that's what it means by mechanically breaking it down. It literally just squeezes it and moves it. And then there's also small stones that grind the food. So a lot of birds, chickens kind of is a famous one in particular, they actually will swallow stones, store them in the gizzard, and will help with the digestion of their food. So that is, again, so the gizzard, so far we have mouth to esophagus to crop to first part of the stomach to second chamber of the stomach, which is the gizzard. And after it leaves the gizzard, the food moves through our intestines, no, not through our intestines, through the intestines of the bird. And then undigested food is expelled through the cloaca, which is just the opening at the end of the digestive system, which is again shared with reptiles and amphibians as well. So that is how food is processed in the birds. So now we're going to go with the respiration, so how birds breathe. So birds, they have a very highly efficient way of taking in oxygen and eliminating CO2, which is going to be necessary if they're going to have to be able to fly. And the first kind of structure is that air enters air sacs. So these are important structures that help the birds. And therefore, and then after that, it flows through the lungs where gas exchange takes place. And then air flows only in a single direction, so it's not kind of going back and forth. And that one-way flow of air is very beneficial because it's constantly exposing the lungs to oxygen-rich air. So air is constantly coming in through the air sacs, going to the lungs, providing the birds with a lot of oxygen. Again, going to help them fly because flying is a very energy-intensive process, and it maintains a high metabolic rate. So that's again another thing. Birds have a very high metabolism, and it provides efficient extraction of oxygen, which enables birds to fly at high altitudes where the air is thin. So there's not as much oxygen when you get up higher, so this one way to flow of air allows birds to take in all the available oxygen that is there, and therefore they will be able to fly basically at any place, any altitude that they need. So that is how their respiration helps a bird survive, again, kind of always going back to the ability to fly. And so now for circulation, birds have a 4-chambered heart, and there's 2 circulatory loops. And there is a complete separation of oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood. So this is again, another thing that helps birds fly, is that their oxygen-rich blood and oxygen-poor blood never come into contact with one another. There's, I think in the reptile heart, there's a partial separation, but it was not fully separated all the time. And so that's, again, another big thing here for our birds. And so our oxygen-poor blood from the body is pumped to the lungs, and oxygen-rich blood returns from the lungs and is pumped to the rest of the body. So again, that's that double loop that they were talking about. And so here again, yeah, it's just the domestic pigeon, what it looks like. Again, all the different parts. Our oxygen-poor blood coming from the body, it gets reoxygenated, or it goes then to the lungs, and then when it comes back to the lungs, it has a lot of oxygen in it, and then it goes out to the rest of the body. So comes in from the body here, our first step, goes through, comes out, and it goes to the lungs, and when it goes to the lungs, it gets oxygen, so then it comes back in this loop, where the red here is representing where we have a lot of oxygen, and then once we get the oxygen-rich blood back from the lungs, we send it out to be used by the rest of the body. And so for our last thing for birds is excretion, and it's very similar to that of most reptiles. So our nitrogenous waste, again, waste is made of nitrogen, are removed from the blood by the kidneys, and they're converted to uric acid, which remember is a solid, and it's deposited into the cloaca. And so then remember, converting it to a solid helps save water, and so most of the water is reabsorbed, and it leaves our uric acid crystals in a white pasty form. And we've all seen bird poop before, so we know what that looks like. Hopefully we haven't had it dropped on us, but it has happened. I can vouch for that personally. So that is it for the second section of birds. Let me know if you have any questions.